Okay, our second introduction is going to focus on terminology that we're going to be using throughout our study of the human body. We have a fairly complex body in terms of the different ways that it can move. And so we're going to need to have what's called a standardized or a correct anatomical position. Whenever we are referring to the body, we are referring to it in correct anatomical position, which is shown here. You are standing with your feet about hip width apart. Your arms are down at your side with your palms facing forward. Your head is up and your eyes are facing forward. By having a standard position to put the body into when we are discussing it, it allows us to account for the fact that our body does move. But when we think about it, we are always going to say, okay, put the body back in correct anatomical position. So the anterior side of your hand is always going to be the palm. It doesn't matter which way it's facing. It's always the palm because you put yourself in correct anatomical position whether the body is actually in that position or not. The other thing we want to look at are the anatomical planes. Within this correct anatomical position, we can discuss three different planes that are going to cut the body into different sections. The simplest is probably transverse. So that is this orange one going through roughly at her waist here. Transverse is as if you were cutting down a tree. You're in the transverse plane of space, and so you will be cutting the body into superior and inferior portions. The sagittal, which is the green one, is going to cut the body into left and right portions. Now, this doesn't have to go right down the midline like it is. It's anywhere along a cut that would cut into right and left. So if you put yourself in correct anatomical position and you make a vertical cut that cuts off your left arm at the shoulder, that's a sagittal plane. You now have a left and a right. The left consists of your arm and the right consists of your entire body minus that arm. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on the midline. Okay. Frontal is going to be represented by the bluish purple here and is going to cut the body into anterior and posterior. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be right along the midline. If you cut off the tip of your nose, you now have an anterior portion, the tip of your nose, and a posterior portion, the rest of your body. So these are not always going to cut perfectly half and half. They are just planes of space that we can cut the body or an organ into. And each one of these would show us something different. Okay. Now, I've been using some directional terms here in discussing those planes. So these are the terms that you are going to want to get familiar with as you study anatomy. You're going to want to start using this terminology in thinking about the body. Instead of thinking the front and back, begin to think anterior and posterior. And it will help you create more comfortable use of these words. So you want to go through here and make sure that all of these kind of make sense to you. So ventral and dorsal, the first two. Ventral means belly, dorsal means spine. So in a human, ventral is also going to mean the anterior surface, whereas posterior is going to mean the dorsal surface. So the front of us is where our belly is, and the back of us is where our spine is. So in a human, ventral and anterior are the same thing. Dorsal and posterior are the same thing. Now, in a quadruped, something that walks on 4 feet, that is not going to work for them. Okay, their dorsal side is going to be their superior side, not posterior. So this only works in humans. Next, we have some terminology that is going to be very used in the nervous system. Cephalic means it's toward the head. Rostral means it's toward the forehead or the nose. And caudal means it's toward the tail. And so when we get into embryonic development of the nervous system, we're going to come across that terminology. Superior and inferior mean above and below. Medial and lateral. To picture these, you want to picture drawing a line right down the middle of your body, and anything that is close to that line will be medial, and anything that's farther away would be lateral. Now, as you think about that, you want to always take into consideration that when you're using these terms, you are always comparing two things. So when we say our eyes are medial to our ears, it means that our eyes are closer to the midline than our ears are. Our ears are medial to our shoulders because our ears are closer to the midline than our shoulders are. So you never just say your ears are lateral, because they are lateral to your eyes, but they're medial to your shoulders. So you're always comparing two things. We always have 2 points of reference here when we are using these anatomical terms. Proximal and distal have to do with how close something is to the point of attachment. For humans, we're going to use proximal and distal for our limbs. And it's important to use a different term for the limbs than we use for other structures because the limbs move. So if you put yourself in correct anatomical position, your elbow is inferior to your shoulder. But now I want you to take your arm and I want you to raise it above your head as if you were asking a question in class. Well, now it moved. That orientation has changed. So we don't want to use superior and inferior as we're talking about the limbs. We want to use proximal and distal. We want to use something that never changes. Proximal means close to the point of attachment. Your shoulder is the most proximal thing on your arm. The farther you get away from the attachment, the more distal you are becoming. So you're going to have an elbow that is distal to the shoulder, a wrist that is distal to the elbow, your fingertips that are distal to your wrist. So as you're going down the arm, you're getting more and more and more distal. As you're coming closer to your shoulder, you're becoming more and more proximal. So let's take our elbow, for example. Our elbow is distal to the shoulder, but proximal to the wrist. So you want to get in the habit of using distal and proximal when you go through the different structures on the limbs, the arms and the legs. Ipsilateral and contralateral have to do with neural pathways generally. And ipsilateral means that the entire pathway stays on the same side of the body. Contralateral means that at some point it crosses to the opposite side of the body. Most of your motor pathways are contralateral. So that means that the left side of your brain controls the right motor movements. So if you are right-handed, that's your left brain in charge of that because it's a contralateral pathway. Superficial and deep have to do with how close something is to the surface versus how deep it is in terms of the body structure. So your skin is superficial, your bones are deep. Okay, so you really just need to work with this, and there's a lot of different pictures and things like that in your book that can help you work through some of these. that you just kind of have to start thinking in terms of this terminology as opposed to what you're used to using. Now, the body regions are just something that you need to start working on right now. They will help you later if you have learned them now. I will give you an example here. The upper shoulder is called the acromial region. And later on, when you get into bones, you're going to find that the scapula, your shoulder blade, has an acromial process right there. Your forehead is called the frontal region, and you've got a frontal bone. The patellar region is the anterior surface of your knee, and there's a patella there. The posterior surface of your knee is the popliteal region. You're going to have a muscle called popliteus. You're going to have a popliteal vein and a popliteal artery that are going to run right through there. So this is just something that you need to start working on as the foundation for your beginning to learn about the human body. When we look in the abdominal region, we have a couple different ways to divide it. The first is what's called a quadrant system. The quadrant system basically just divides it into 4 equal quadrants and is going to look at the different organs that would be in each area. It's not quite as detailed as the regional version of this, which is to basically divide this into kind of like a tic-tac-toe region. So there are anatomical lines that are going to be drawn here. So the mid-clavicular lines are your vertical lines. The subcostal line at the 10th rib is your first horizontal line, and then your intertubercular line runs right below your anterior superior iliac spine on the pelvis. So there are definitely, this is not an arbitrarily drawn tic-tac-toe board. And then your regions are going to be a lot smaller. When you're dealing with abdominal pain, it can sometimes be a lot more useful to show somebody the regional version of the abdomen versus the quadrant version, simply because you're going to be able to narrow down the scope of the pain a little bit easier. So the majority of the organs that we're going to see in the body outside of the skeletal and muscular systems are going to reside in body cavities. And we basically have 2 big separations. We've got a dorsal cavity that houses the brain and the spinal cord, which is your cranial and vertebral canals there. And then you've got the ventral cavity consisting of the thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. Now you can see that there are different delineations in here. And as you work through Atlas A in your book, you will find a lot of pictures that have a lot of different versions of all of the different organs that are found in these systems. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with that. Know what is found in each pleural cavity, which would be your lungs. The pericardial cavity, that's where you're going to find your heart. Cranial cavity, that's where your brain is. The mediastinum, it's got a portion of your heart. It's got your esophagus. It's got the trachea. So you're going to want to work through what would be found in each of these different cavities. And you can see that the thoracic cavity is very subdivided, while the abdominal pelvic cavity is not. When we get into 252 and we talk about the organs found in there, we will find that there are definitely some consequences to that, that we don't have subdivisions in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, the separation between them is the diaphragm muscle. So that's what separates the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavities. So that's a complete anatomical delineation there. Each of these cavities is going to be lined by a membrane. that we will get to when we get into them. But here you can see that the cranial and vertebral canals are going to be dealing with something called the meninges. The thoracic cavity, you're going to be dealing with the pleura around the lungs, the pericardium around the heart, and then in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we're going to be dealing with peritoneum. So all of these are the cavities where we would find all of the organs, and they are all membrane lined. Organ systems are going to give us a map of how we're going to study the body. Now remember, we do have to lay the foundation before we get there, so we won't be jumping in right with organ systems, but eventually we will get to them. So we start with the first three systems, which are the integumentary, skeletal, and muscular systems. This is basically the kind of the first half of 251. So the integumentary system obviously is going to be a protection. It's your skin, hair, nails, your gland structures. You want to go through it and you want to make sure that you know the functions here. There's obviously one that stands out. Skin is protection. Bones is support. Muscles are movement. But there are also minor functions that are going to be important physiologically, such as your bones being a mineral storage unit and the place where we form our blood cells. So make sure that you go through and you actually look at all of the functions of these organ systems and not just the primary function. So the first half will take us through integumentary, skeletal, muscle systems. And then we're going to move into the nervous and endocrine. These actually at one time were one system called the neuroendocrine system. So we have eventually teased them apart due to the fact that they do work a little bit differently from each other, but they are both going to be involved in controlling the rest of the body. And so we're going to go through nervous and endocrine, and that will finish up 251. 252 is then going to pick up with the circulatory system and its related system, the lymphatic system. These are all going to be dealing with the concept of moving fluids and distributing things around the body. Then we have several systems that are going to have multiple functions in maintaining homeostasis, but they are all going to be excretory. So they are all going to be involved in excreting waste products. So the respiratory system is going to deal with oxygen and carbon dioxide. The urinary system is a major player in homeostasis. And the digestive system is how we're going to bring in our nutrients. But they all have to get rid of waste products, along with the integumentary system. Sweat is a waste product. Once we get done with that, we will move into the reproductive systems and talk about how we continue the species. So the reproductive systems are the only systems that are not really working towards homeostasis. They kind of have their own thing going on. They are working over in the process of making sure that we continue the species. So they kind of have their own thing going on. But we will get into all of these organ systems in 252.